spoilers for The Last of Us Episode 2 and The Last of Us game. So, I was wrong. Tess doesn't die in Episode 3. She dies in this episode, which it kind of makes sense in hindsight, considering the issue with pacing. I think if she died in Episode 3, they'd have to shorten a bit of the story in the later half, which I'd rather them shorten the beginning of the story than the latter half. So I'm actually okay with that. I'm really curious to what Episode 3 has in store for us, because it's supposed to be one of the best episodes of the season, and it's the longest episode of the season. But with that said, this was a very good episode. It's really keeping the momentum going from the first episode, which is also really good to hear. I feel like I kind of have that worry that somewhere along the lines the show's going to drop the ball, but it's given me no reason to think that so far. There were a few changes in this episode that did catch my eye, but we'll go into that a little bit later on. This episode starts on a flashback just before the outbreak, and it takes place in Jakarta, Indonesia, which if you were paying attention to episode 1, they hinted at the outbreak possibly starting in Jakarta over the radio. Now here we get a little bit more insight to the infection and the outbreak, and a little bit more on how the infection spreads, and it proves the flour and grain theory correct, which if you don't know, the flour and grain theory comes from a newspaper clipping in the game that basically suggests that the infection host, it was spread by flour and foods in the beginning. With Jakarta having the biggest flour mill in the world, it would make sense that this would be ground zero for the outbreak. And some keen-eyed fans actually pointed out that in the beginning, Joel and Sarah avoid eating flour. Joel is on Atkins and they didn't have flour for pancakes, and Joel didn't pick up a cake at the end of the episode. Sarah didn't take the cookies that the neighbors baked, so they could have just narrowly escaped infection. I kind of hope that they keep these flashbacks in the beginning of the episodes going, because I really enjoy the world building. It seems like they're taking the advantage of using an adaptation to actually expand on the lore of the world. I really like the little changes that they've made and the little additions that they've added. It actually gives the adaptation a purpose rather than just video game to film. We get another little line about there not being a vaccine possible, just a little bit thrown in there. We pick up right where the previous episode ended, right outside the collapsing skyscrapers. Joel, Tess, and Ellie are having a little breakfast before they head out. Now this scene kind of reinforces how Tess and Joel actually see Ellie. They see her more as a job rather than an actual human being and a possible cure for the infection. They're both very skeptical of the reality that there might actually be a cure for this infection. They've heard it all before. But once we get outside, we actually get to see the full scale of the set, and it's amazing. It's absolutely just beautiful. The fact that they're able to recreate these from the game and make them look as good as they do and as natural as they do, hats off to them. Even my girlfriend noted that it looks a lot like the sets from the game. Now, I was a little bit sad that they cut the skyscraper section. This is one of the most memorable sections of the intro to the game, and it's one of my favorite sections, and it sucks because they teased it in the ending of the first episode, but at the same time, I do kind of get why they cut it. It wouldn't do the pacing very much justice if they had a section where they introduced the clickers in the skyscraper like they did in the game, but then also have the clickers in the museum before they get to the Capitol building. So in that case, it kind of makes sense, and I'm glad they did it. But I was still a little bit butthurt that I didn't get to see the inside of these skyscrapers. One thing I noticed in the beginning of this episode is that Joel doesn't talk very much. He might say a sentence here and there, but for the most part, he's just silent. Ellie and Tess seem to do most of the talking at first. A little bit of bonding, a little bit of getting to know each other. But I really like that they reinforce how uncomfortable Joel is actually doing this mission. They eventually make their way to the hotel. Now, this section's pulled exactly from the game, but the only difference is that this section is actually later on in the game. Instead, they just moved it forward, which is fine. It's not that big of a deal. And the set looked phenomenal. Like, it was plucked straight from the game. It looked so good. And they used this section to inform us that Ellie doesn't know how to swim, which if you played the games, you know that Ellie doesn't know how to swim. We've had to get her across on wooden pallets way too many times. We get so many pieces of this set that are just pulled straight from the game. It looks absolutely phenomenal, and it still just doesn't feel real. Like, this shouldn't actually exist, but it does, and we're watching it. And we actually get to see some of the optional dialogue from the game being used. We get to see more of the Ellie-risms that we recognize from the character from the game. Bella Ramsey proves once again that she is Ellie. She does such a good job just becoming this character. I do not understand all the Bella Ramsey hate. A lot of people are just upset based on her looks, which, come on, that's not cool. That's not a quirky hot take, you're just being a bully. Which surely the Last of Us community doesn't have a history of bullying, right? From here, Tess ends up having to split off. We get to see one of the game mechanics where you boost her over the wall, which that's a fun little bit that they threw in there. I'm still sad that we haven't seen a brick or a bottle yet, but hopefully soon. Tess goes off to scout ahead while we leave Joel and Ellie to have their awkward little bonding moment. They kind of reluctantly talk to each other, asking little questions about where they're from, or it's really fun to watch seeing how uncomfortable these two are around each other. They're really dragging this relationship out, and I love it. Chemistry between Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey is really what's going to make or break this show, and so far they're nailing it. Once they meet up with Tess, we get another little bit of lore addition. We see a bunch of infected grouped together, and Ellie points out that it looks like they're connected. Tess gives a little exposition on the infected being hive mind-like. There seems to be veins of fungus underneath the ground that spread for miles, so meaning you can kill an infected a mile away, and you can end up alerting the horde and they'll know exactly where you're at, which is a little bit of foreshadowing. Honestly, I like it. It makes sense. I mean, it just makes the fungus seem more realistic, as if we needed that anyway. With their pathway being blocked by infected, it means they have to go through the museum, which again, this set is pulled straight from the game. Now in the show, this is the first time that we come across the clickers, which originally the clickers showed up in the skyscraper section, but since they cut it out, this is the first time that we encounter clickers in the series, and they're perfect. They're absolutely terrifyingly perfect. They nailed it. They look so good. They look identical to the ones from the game. They sound, they move, everything perfect. And the scene is very tense and very scary. Even though I know what's going to happen, it still leaves me on the edge of my seat. Like, I was over there making fists. I wanted to grab the controller and get them out of there. They did an awesome job building up to the clicker moment. If you haven't seen them in the game before, I imagine the build up to this was actually really terrifying. And just seeing what they're capable of, the fact that they move around based on echolocation with the clicks, and they're alerted by sounds, almost like the monster from A Quiet Place. The last quiet place. The quiet of us. The last place of us. Now, there was a scene that really stressed me out where Joel is quietly trying to reload his revolver, and I didn't think about that because I don't remember reloading ever alerting the clickers before in the game. It might have, I just wasn't paying attention, but you can tell that he's quietly trying to do it so he doesn't alert the clicker, and the camera pans over so that it's just focused on Joel while he's reloading, and then when it pans back, the clicker is right there next to him, and it's so stressful, but I love it. After all is said and done, Ellie gets bit a second time, being the first person to survive not only one but 2 bites from an infected. She's out here setting records as the most unlucky lucky girl. But Tess also gets bitten, and if you've played the games, you can kind of spot this, but if you haven't, you might have picked up on it anyway, seeing as her entire demeanor and attitude changes after this scene. And then finally we get to the part where they cross the wooden plank from building to building. This is a very memorable scene from the game, and it's one that we've seen in the trailers too. This is another part where the dialogue is ripped straight from the game, and I think this time they did a lot better job with it. Like, the line delivery was almost spot on, and it didn't have this weird off-putting feeling like the first episode kind of did, which it wasn't even like that big of a deal. It's just kind of a small nitpick for me personally, but this time I feel like they nailed it. They did a very, very good job. And it's not like it's a forced scene where it's like, oh, now we got to enter the fan service. It just feels like it was natural and it worked. And one addition to the scene is we get Joel checking his watch. Just a little tidbit in there, just a little. Now we get to the Capitol building, and just like before, all the Fireflies are dead. But this time it wasn't from Fedra. We find out that it was actually the Fireflies were killed by infected, which I kind of like this change because, one, it makes the infected more of a threat, which we already know the infected's a threat, but making it like the main threat of this episode just kind of ties it all together, and it keeps the continuity. And then we get a payoff to the hive mind foreshadowing from an earlier scene. With a horde of infected on their way and Tess being infected herself, she ends up sacrificing herself to give Joel and Ellie time to escape, just like in the game, but not before having a really hot makeout session with one of these infected. I wish I was joking, but when Joel finds out that Tess is infected, he doesn't mess around. Like, he shows his frustration of the situation, but the reality of it kicks in pretty quickly. Tess delivers this awesome line, save who you can save. And he grabs Ellie and he just runs. He just leaves Tess behind. He understands the situation. He's a survivor and he gets straight out of there. And I really like to see that in Joel's character. And now we get to the point where Joel and Ellie are on their own together. It's hinted at that they're going to go see Bill and Frank next. So in episode 3, I imagine that we're going to get a lot more Bill and Frank, which is pretty cool because in the game we didn't get a whole lot of that. But we do get a lot of Joel and Ellie bonding, which I'm hoping to see a lot of that in the next episode, seeing as it's the longest episode in the series. But with Bill and Frank being teased so much, I imagine that we're going to see a lot more backstory there, which I'm very excited about that. But overall, I really love the fact that this show is adding so much context to the lore and it's really building on the world. Like, that's the point of an adaptation to me, and they're nailing it. Like, the games and the show, while being the same, are pretty separate, and I think that the adaptation is proving its worth. It doesn't feel like it's just for fan service. It can stand on its own feet, and if you've never played the game, you can watch this show and it would be just fine. The new additions to the Infected are awesome and creepy and just perfect, and I think the set designs are absolutely amazing. I can't wait to see all of my favorite sets from the game brought into the show. It's really something special. But that's it for now, and I'll see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe. Okay, bye-bye.